All right. Hello, everyone. I think we are ready to get going here. Thank you, first of all, for being here and your interest in this webinar, this launch webinar. My name is Maliki Fernando, and I'm a project manager at the International Transport Forum. And it's my honor today to moderate this webinar. We will be showcasing two new publications under a project, well, two projects, looking at decarbonizing transport in India. There's the NDC Transport Initiative for Asia and the Decarbonizing Transport in Emerging Economies projects, both funded by the International Climate Initiative. And we are very happy to present today and focus today on the life cycle assessment of passenger transport, an Indian case study, alongside our colleagues from the World Bank who have co-written this report with us. It's the first comprehensive life cycle analysis of passenger transport modes in India, and it relies on the ITF Transport Life Cycle Assessment Tool, which was also released last week and is the first of its kind characterized to the Indian transport context. That is also freely available for download, and you'll hear a bit about that later on. Just as a bit of background, early on in these projects, ITF and Niti Aayog, our implementing partners in India, identified life cycle assessment as a gap in the transport research space in India, and one that would be valuable to fill. And they have been strong supporters of this tool and study that will help inform future investment and policy. And today, providing their perspectives on the relevance of this work for exactly that purpose, we have the honor of hearing from two distinguished guests, Mr. Sudhendu Sinha, who is an advisor at Niti Aayog, and Mr. Vishal Kapoor, who is the CEO of Convergence Energy Services Limited, or CESL. I will say a bit more about them before they speak and they get a chance to come in. But to kick off our event, we will first hear from Gerald Olivier, who is a lead transport specialist at the World Bank and a key collaborator with us since very early on. And he will provide some context for this work as well as its relevance for climate-oriented financing. We will then hear about the report itself from Vatsalya Sohu, policy analyst at the ITF, who co-authored this study alongside Ravi Gaddapalli, who is a consultant for the World Bank. Vatsalya will present the scope and key recommendations, followed by a quick overview of the LCA tool, life cycle assessment, or LCA, as I will probably refer to it throughout this. And Ravi will follow with a more technical presentation focusing on the analysis, the assumptions, and so on. Just before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. Use the Q&A function if you would like to present a question to one of our speakers. There will be time afterwards, and we want to hear from you, our audience, to see what you'd like to learn a little bit more about. Yeah, I think that is all I have for you, and we can start off straight with Gerald to kick off this webinar. Gerald, over to you.
Thank you so much, Maliti. First, great pleasure to be with all of you. Pleasure to have also the distinguished Sri Sinha and Sri Kapoor with us today. Certainly, they have been leading a lot of the thinking about e-mobility over the years. I would like to congratulate Niti Aayog for the leadership in moving forward the NDC-TIA, because that focus on creating the right set of tools to advance decarbonization is really quite fundamental and is going to be applied quite readily. Also, would like to thank OECD, ITF for the great cooperation over the past year and a half, both Maliti, Vatsalya, but also Pier Paolo in the development of a model that has been used for the LCA. That cooperation is very useful because while carbon emission is not the only decision-making parameter when it comes to selecting projects, it's becoming growingly important. As many of you may know, institutions like the World Bank follow a process of Paris alignment, where all the projects are being reviewed in terms of what impacts they will have on carbon emission. So the type of tool that now not only looks at the emission at the point of consumption, but the entire LCA approach is a new way of embedding those type of assessment in a number of applications. So let me mention 4 applications where foreign institutions like the World Bank, the LCA analysis is quite essential. The first one is when we look at the broad transition towards a net zero scenario in India. We look at passenger kilometer, ton kilometers, and how those can be transported across different modes of transport, different technologies, in ways that accelerate the pathway to no carbon emission. And as we do that, we look at aspects like traffic taking place in cities or intercity, and we're able to see what are the sectors or subsectors that are going to be the most essential. So to give you an example, we would be looking at intercity transport and realize that with the current low ownership in vehicles in India, personal vehicle in India, then buses have a very strong role to play. And when looking at buses, the question becomes, should it be a conventional bus or an electric bus? We then are able to use the LCA tool to look at what happens over the life cycle of an electric bus compared to what would happen if people were using cars to go from one city to another. And we see that over such life cycle, using an e-bus, you would have 1,200 tons of CO2 emitted. While using personal cars, you would have something like 6,000 tons emitted. So a factor of 5 between the two scenarios. So the first application of the tool is to understand the big picture transformation that can happen at the size of the country. The second is when we work in cities like Chennai and work on the development of a comprehensive mobility plan, the big focus is on trying to understand which solution to foster the most in order to achieve a series of green, resilient, inclusive development objectives. And as we go through that, the carbon emission of each mode becomes quite important. So we are able through the LCA essentially to see the hierarchy of most effective solution from non-motorized transport to using metros, to using e-bus, to using regular bus, to two-wheelers, to three-wheelers, in ways that shows what is the impact per passenger kilometer of each of those. So an e-bus, for example, will be generating about 29 grams of carbon emission per passenger kilometer. A conventional bus will do so with 37 grams. An electric three-wheelers or two-wheeler will jump to 44 to 46 grams. And when you go to a conventional diesel three-wheeler or the use of a passenger car, you will go to 100 grams. So the difference between the options are quite significant. It can be a factor of 3 for the same number of passenger kilometer being carried, and they become quite important. The third type of application for the LCA is when developing large programs that look at the transition from one technology to another in a certain type of vehicle. So for example, NITI Aayog has been looking very proactively on how to accelerate the transition towards electric 2- and 3-wheelers. And the question comes, why does it matter? Well, looking at the LCA tool, you can see that as you move from a conventional two-wheeler to an electric one, you save about 3 tons of carbon emission over the life cycle of that vehicle. Now, 3 tons is quite significant when you consider that today 95% of new two-wheelers are conventional two-wheelers, and you have about 20 million being added each year. So, the acceleration of the transition towards electric 2- and 3-wheeler start having a very sizable impact when you multiply the volume with the life cycle associated with those vehicles. Likewise, a 3-wheeler, we can see that from the LCA analysis that we shared with you, that you would have 15 to 30 tons of carbon emission saving per vehicle as they move from conventional to electric. So all of these elements are interesting, but in addition to that, you start looking at what is the origin essentially of the carbon emission associated with each type of vehicle. And you can see that for smaller form factor vehicle like 2- and 3-wheeler, the manufacturing, the infrastructure associated with a vehicle generate quite a significant percentage of the total emission over the life cycle of a vehicle, which means that you need to think about what can be done to maximize the impact associated with those vehicles, which translate into how to focus first on vehicles that are used intensively. So in that case, it means that for 2- and 3-wheeler, the focus should be on a fleet vehicle that have usage of 100 to 200 kilometers per day as a way to maximize the benefit associated with the transition towards them. Likewise, when you look at buses and the conversion from bus to e-bus, thinking about the large plans that were announced during Independence Day in India, the life cycle of a 12-meter e-bus is going to be about 840 tons compared to 1,300 tons in the context of a diesel bus. So there is a saving that is quite substantial, about 460 tons over the life cycle of a bus when you make the decision of moving from one type to the other. Further to that, if you were to do what Mumbai is pursuing now, which is to charge your electric buses purely with green energy, you would be able to save an extra 680 tons. So it's a total saving of 1,140 tons per bus compared to a conventional bus. Again, why does it matter? Because growingly, we are going to see that people are able to monetize part of those savings. And as one can monetize, those savings actually start becoming quite significant in terms of making the financial viability of that transition more relevant. So if we are able to monetize at $10 a ton, 1,000 tons, you have $10,000 that can be used in order to facilitate the transition towards electric vehicle. The last one that I would mention is that when you look in the context of a project at the corridor development, and you compare a metro versus a electric bus approach for the corridor development, what you can see is that there are notions of embedded carbon that comes from the infrastructure in the metro. That means that it starts making sense from a carbon emission perspective only once you reach a certain level of traffic, right? Because you have a fixed amount of emission coming from the construction that need to be spread out over enough unit of passenger in order for this to be a worthwhile equation. So, those 4 levels, from the global level to the city level to the looking at the program of transition to specific project, give us data points. The LCA give us data points that are quite useful as we move forward. Now, all of these are a bit specific. And as Maliti mentioned at the beginning, what is powerful is actually there is a tool associated with that will let you tailor essentially to your situation some of the parameters. So maybe you have bigger bus or smaller bus, or you need longer range or shorter range. All of this that can be modified within the model quite easily so that you have an LCA that is appropriate for your context. So looking forward to the discussion today, and back to you, Maliti.
Thank you, Gerald, for outlining those excellent points on how this is relevant to so many different contexts. I will now pass on to Vatsalya Sohu and Ravi Gadapalli, who will focus a little bit more on the actual study recommendations and the analysis behind it. So Vatsalya, over to you.
Thank you, Maliti. Can you see my screen? Okay, perfect. Well, thank you again. And hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Vatsalya Sohu, and I'm from the ITF, and I'll be briefly introducing the study, going over the key recommendations, before letting Ravi take over for some of the detailed analysis and the results. I'll also quickly go over the LCA tool in my part. Starting with the study first. So today, as Gerald also mentioned, thankfully, decarbonization is a critical decision-making criterion for the transport sector investments, along with others like accessibility and economic and strategic benefits. This ITF World Bank study presents a decision-making approach based on life cycle assessment, LCA, which considers not only the carbon emissions from a vehicle's use, but also from its manufacturing, from its delivery, the infrastructure needs. The expectation is that such a data-driven approach will help decision makers, policymakers assess the decarbonization potential of policies and of investing in alternative transport modes and vehicle and fuel technologies associated with them. Quickly going over the scope of the study presents results for passenger transport modes. We include private and shared modes. And public transport. Both private and shared transport applications of cars and two-wheelers were analyzed. Different sizes of buses were also analyzed for urban and intercity operation with varying operating conditions for both air-conditioned and non-air-conditioned variants. The vehicle technologies considered for the study were internal combustion engines, so ICE, battery electric vehicles, BEV, and fuel cell electric vehicles, which is FCEV. We considered diesel, petrol, CNG, blue hydrogen, which is CNG-based, green hydrogen, which is 100% renewable energy-based, as the fuel types. And the analysis calculates greenhouse gas emissions for each phase within the life cycle of the vehicle. And these are vehicle and battery manufacturing, transportation of the vehicle to the point of sale, vehicle use, including emissions from the production of the required fuels and energy, and the related infrastructure. Finally, just a note, we studied per vehicle emissions for modes and vehicles where reliable data was available specific to India. You will see that we don't have bicycles as a mode, and the reason is the lack of reliable data on bicycles in India at the moment. Quickly also going over the energy scenarios considered in the study. The first is the intended policy scenario, which represents the transition of electricity to clean energy based on previously announced policies at COP21. Next is the net zero scenario, which is an accelerated energy transition to meet net zero targets as proposed during COP26. And the third is 100% renewable energy scenario for buses. This is given that the authorities and operators are already considering and establishing such arrangements as a part of their clean energy and cost-saving measures. Two additional scenarios were also considered, as you can see on your screens. A scenario for battery electric intercity buses powered by 100% renewable energy and comparing them with hydrogen-powered intercity buses. And finally, a constant emissions energy scenario. While this is unrealistic, such a scenario helps us understand the impact of alternative technologies in the immediate future. Finally, the outputs from the study are measured as total GHG emissions of the vehicle over its lifetime. We also have average GHG emissions per vehicle kilometer and per passenger kilometer. Now, here are the key recommendations from the study, and I will quickly go over them in the next few slides one by one. So the study finds that the most impactful would be a twin strategy of shifting users from private vehicles to buses and electrifying these buses at the same time. We find that battery electric buses have at least 24% lower emissions per passenger kilometer compared to 2- and 3-wheelers, 70% lower than private cars, and 79% lower than shared cars. Hence, a modal shift to buses and simultaneously electrifying them can bring the highest amounts of GHG emission savings. The next would be electrifying 2- and 3-wheelers, given that they make up a large portion of India's vehicle fleet with over 15 million vehicles. Accelerating their transition to BEVs also avoids lock-in effects that can lead to high aggregate GHG emission savings. Among cars, it is crucial to prioritize electric cars. When we look at the entire life cycle, shared electric cars emit about 50% less emissions than their diesel-fueled counterparts. We know that cars will not be substituted by buses, or will only be substituted by buses after a period of time, that this cannot happen overnight. But in order to accelerate the green transition, we must also prioritize shared electric cars. The fourth focuses on metros in Indian cities, and we find that it is absolutely essential that high demand corridors are selected for metro lines. While metro rail systems have low operating emissions, they also have relatively high emissions embedded in their infrastructure and rolling stock. Therefore, setting high targets for ridership and meeting them is crucial to realize the emission savings from the introduction of metro rail systems. The fifth, mainstreaming life cycle assessment into public policy and investment decisions. So our study underlines the importance of looking at life cycle emissions when taking policy and investment decisions. Even with zero tailpipe emissions, BEVs emit significant greenhouse gases in the manufacturing and the infrastructure phases. For example, manufacturing can contribute up to 37% of emissions in the case of BEVs due to the emissions and intensity of battery manufacturing. And for the infrastructure phase, this can reach up to 95%. Hence, it is essential that the entire life cycle emissions impact is studied when policy and investment decisions are being taken. And finally, we found that the GHG emissions of BEVs are lower than ICE variants across all vehicle types, as long as the currently announced clean energy policy goals are achieved. An accelerated transition to a clean energy grid is, in fact, essential in order for India to maximize their GHG emission savings from electrification. So these were briefly our key recommendations from this analysis, and my colleague Ravi Gadipalli from the World Bank will go into some of the results in depth very shortly. But before that, I would also like to bring your attention quickly to the LCA tool on which the study is based. The LCA tool is available online on the ITF website and can be downloaded free along with its manual. The ITF Transport LCA tool calculates the energy use and emissions for the full life cycle of a vehicle, including the phases that I mentioned earlier as well. So manufacturing, the transport of the vehicles to the place of use, the use of the vehicles, operational services needed for some specific vehicles, and finally, the infrastructure construction and maintenance. As I mentioned, the tool is available along with its user manual online to be downloaded freely. We highly recommend you read the manual before using the tool. The tool currently includes 32 passenger vehicle types. It considers both ICE and battery electric vehicles, 2- and 4-wheelers in private and shared categories, 3-wheelers, urban buses, coach buses, and metro and urban trains. And petrol, diesel, and CNG options are considered for ICE vehicles where relevant. The tool allows users to provide input data for critical variables or choose a default value. The defaults were based on data collection specific to India for most of the critical variables, like for vehicle and use characteristics. The tool includes 3 different energy scenarios for producing electricity and the option for the users to define a 4th energy mix. As you can see, the tool calculates results for GHG emissions and energy consumptions, with energy consumption shown here. We see that the energy consumption for vehicles entire lifetime per passenger kilometer, vehicle kilometer, and per vehicle. Here you can see, as expected, there is the difference between per PKM analysis, where mass transport modes perform much better, as these have higher energy consumption when you consider vehicle kilometers. We encourage anyone interested to please go ahead and try the tool for themselves. We are also currently working with colleagues from IIT Dhanbad to incorporate freight transport into the tool, and that will be released shortly in the coming months. And with that, I will hand over to Ravi to take it from here.
Thank you, Vatsalya. Hello, everyone. Nice to be here. So the context and the messages have already been delivered. So my job here is to give the numbers behind. So luckily, Government of India has already adopted these policies towards low carbon transport to shift towards public transport, non-motorized transport, electric mobility. So they have all been taken up. But the idea here is to quantify the net impact of each of these initiatives so that we know exactly what is the output of the investments towards each of this. There are policies, there are regulations, there are incentives being given to each of these areas, mode shift and technology transfer. So what is the net impact of that? So that is the objective of this tool. And also there are several questions still remaining on, we have a lot of coal power, is it still worth going towards electric? We have hydrogen, is it still worth going electric? So towards answering that, we use this tool for our own understanding, and then based on the results, we have now published the results. So as a user of the tool that Vatsala just explained, there are all these life cycle items, manufacturing, usage of the vehicle, transport, operations. And then you need to give individual inputs on what is the vehicle type you want to choose, cars or private cars, commercial cars, whichever vehicle type you choose. Then the technology, whether it is petrol, diesel, CNG, electric, hydrogen. Then the energy scenario. Do you want to look at the current energy mix or the increasingly green energy mix that government India is already pursuing? And then you have the vehicle activity related details. On for each type of vehicle you select, what is the life of the vehicle, kilometers traveled, energy efficiency, and then the manufacturing related items like the weight of the vehicle, material mix, etc. So obviously, when we started this exercise, most of these data points were not available. So we did a lot of literature reviews, stakeholder consultations, and a lot of discussions and reports, etc. So thanks to all the people who have provided inputs over a period of time. And now we have a baseline set for India. And people using this tool from now on can use the baseline or default values, or they can also change it to their own context. So just to give a flavor of all the inputs that went into it, I'm not going to explain all the numbers, but just to give a flavor of the kind of inputs that go into it. For each vehicle type and its application, whether it is a personal application or a commercial application, the kind of energy use, what is the life of the vehicle, then the kilometers it drives every year, then the capacity of the battery. So because each vehicle is different, each city is different, all these values keep changing. The idea here is to have a benchmark value for India so that we know at a broad level, a car emits so much or a two-wheeler emits so much. So of course, anyone can question all these assumptions and then change it. So the tool is modular enough to change it, but our endeavor was to get a representative value for India so that we give some policy input for decision makers. So each of these values is of course subject to change, but I think these are representative of the overall market in India. So there is energy efficiency, then there is a battery capacity, number of batteries to be replaced throughout the life of the vehicle, the energy efficiency also. And then there are the energy related inputs like the grid emission factor, where we looked at 3 different scenarios. Excuse me. So the current energy mix of India, where we have about 73% coal share of electricity. And then there are other policy scenarios, the Paris Agreement scenario, where we assume that coal share will reduce to 51% by 2030 and 20% by 50. There's also a net zero scenario now government agreed to, where it is likely that the coal share can get down to 44% by 2030 and 11% by 2050. So based on this, you will see here that the grid emission factor varies for different vehicle types. That is because the life of the vehicle is different. If you take 2022 as a baseline, so based on the life of the vehicle, the grid emission factor is determined for that particular year. So a vehicle with short life will have higher grid emission factor, and a longer life will have lower grid emission factor because it consumes energy in the future when the grid is more green. So based on that, we get first vehicle-wise inputs, and then we have comparative inputs also. The report has much more detail, but for today's discussion, I only captured the life cycle emissions for each vehicle type and then compared the per passenger kilometer value to get the key messages across. So first on the cars, the one overarching message across vehicle types is that across energy scenarios, even if at the current grid scenario or the improving grid scenario, electric vehicles are always showing up as a greener option. That is because the energy efficiency of the vehicles is higher in terms of just the kilowatt hours of energy consumed per kilometer. So it's only a matter of the magnitude of saving you will get based on the energy scenario across vehicle types. So a personal car will have around 12 to 13, 14 tons of CO2 emission savings over its life cycle, whereas a commercial car would have 50 to 70 tons of savings. That's because the more kilometers you drive, the more savings you make because of the energy efficiency benefits of electric vehicles. Similarly, in case of two-wheelers, we see that personal uh, scooters and motorcycles have about 1.1 to 1.9 tons of saving, whereas a commercial scooter motorcycle has 1.9 to 3 tons of saving. The interesting thing here is that in case of ICE vehicles, motorcycles are better than scooters based on the currently available models. Whereas in case of electric, the scooters are better than motorcycles, which was interesting. But at the same time, these vehicle models are evolving all the time. So we have to keep regularly watching the space to understand the latest. The next is the three-wheeler segment, where we see that there is diesel and CNG. It's not just one baseline technology. There is also LNG in some cities, but most cities have either diesel or CNG. CNG is already cleaner than diesel, but we see that electric vehicles are much more cleaner than even CNG vehicles. That's a question we keep getting in several cities, that if we just move to CNG, should we still move to electric or not? So we see that there is about 30 tons of saving by moving to electric. And for a diesel vehicle, for even CNG, it is 15 to up to 26 tons also, depends on the energy scenario. Then we get into the buses. So buses is much more interesting from an analytical point of view because there are so many different types of buses. There is urban bus, intercity bus. Within urban, there is 12 meter, 9 meter. Then there is AC, non-AC. We try to capture 4 key models, 12 meter, 9 meter, AC and non-AC. Of course, India has several other models, but these are the maximum volume that we see. So Gerald already highlighted these numbers. We see that in case of AC buses, the savings are the highest because for AC diesel versus AC electric, the energy efficiency increases significantly. Whereas the non-AC buses that we have currently are have good, decent energy efficiency from a diesel perspective. So the savings are slightly lower. But even in non-AC buses, we see a significant enough saving that you still invest in electric buses. So the numbers are that for diesel, it goes from 400 to 530 tons of saving per vehicle, depending on the energy scenario. And for CNG also, it is at least 200 tons to 500 tons for different types of vehicles. In case of non-AC, the savings are in the 70 to 200 ton range. The other thing is, like Gerald mentioned, cities like Mumbai are now trying to procure renewable energy for their buses. Then the savings are much more accentuated. So the savings can go up to 1100 tons per bus over its life cycle if it is a 12 meter AC bus, and at least 400 tons in some cases. So that is a key shift. Then in case of intercity buses, we looked at a couple of other scenarios also. First, the absolute tons of CO2 is much higher for intercity buses, primarily because of the extra activity, more kilometers per day. But in this case, we also looked at what if there is hydrogen powered buses, because now we are hearing in the market that there is more and more testing going on this topic. But we see that Indian manufacturers are opting towards blue hydrogen, where they focus on CNG based hydrogen. And we also looked at the green hydrogen option as a test case. We see just because we are looking at green hydrogen, we also look at the 100% RE scenario, just like we looked at urban buses. One key message is that the big picture message is just moving to electric in case of intercity buses is a significantly higher emission saving choice compared to urban buses. You can go up to 1,000 tons of savings, or you can reduce 50% of the emissions by going to pure electric, irrespective of the energy scenario. Secondly, if you go to blue hydrogen, you only get up to 380-90 tons of savings, which is actually lower than what an urban bus would save. So blue hydrogen is still a greener option than the current choice, but it doesn't give you enough return compared to an electric bus. And then if you look at green hydrogen versus 100% RE, actually green hydrogen has slightly higher emission than 100% RE because of the electrolysis and the energy consumed at that stage. But of course, again, this is subject to assumptions, and if there are better processes coming in for electrolysis, the numbers will change. But based on the currently available data, So it looks like 100% RE electric intercity bus would be the most energy saving choice. Then we look at the metro rail systems. As Vatsalya already mentioned, there are significant embedded emissions in the metro, where the moment you build the metro, you at least consume almost 11,000 tons CO2 for every lane kilometer you build. But then over the life cycle of 40, 50 years, you'll get a saving of almost 11,500 to 12,000 tons of saving, assuming that a lot of people are using it. So we see that this is done assuming that we have at least 6,000 peak hour per direction trips, or a metro every 4 minutes, and then which is at 80% occupancy, 50% occupancy, etc. So unless you get 6,000, these numbers are assuming 6,000 peak hour per direction trips. So if demand reaches 15,000, sorry about the typing mistake here, it reaches 15,000, but these are actually even better than buses. But if the ridership is lower, the embedded emissions involved in metro will actually supersede the savings. So for smaller cities where there is not enough demand, we have to reevaluate whether metro is the right choice or not. Next, we look at the phase-wise emissions. So because the whole point of life cycle is at which stage of the life is the emission happening. Majority of the emissions are in the usage phase. The infrastructure emissions, although lower, are highest for two-wheelers and then metro rail systems, followed by cars, three-wheelers, and buses. In the manufacturing emissions are higher for private vehicles, but of course the absolute values are lower. But because the actual kilometers they travel is lesser, the manufacturing share of the life cycle emission is slightly higher for private vehicles. The other theme is the air quality impact. Until now, we focused on CO2 emissions, which is long-term climate change mitigation. But India also has significant air pollution problems. So at the previous workshop we had in January, there was a lot of emphasis on the need for air quality analysis. The issue is that there are coal emissions, coal-based power plants and their emissions. But the actual net impact is the exposure that people get to these coal-based power plant emissions. So once we convert to exposure and compare electric vehicle emissions from the power plants and the ICE vehicles, of course, from the tailpipe emissions, we see that despite the high carbon electricity, there is significant net air pollution impact. Because in some conferences we hear that, oh, you're only shifting the pollution from the cities to the power plants, but it is actually not true. We are reducing overall air pollution in general. So until now, I focused on life cycle of per vehicle emissions. Now we get down to individual choices and their per kilometer emissions. So at a city level, when a city is deciding its mode share targets, so what matters is for every kilometer of person trips happening, what is the emission? So once you look at that, metro has the least per passenger kilometer emission at the demand level that I mentioned, 6,000 peak hour per direction trips. Then followed by electric buses. So one thing is we already established in the previous slides that electric is better than ICE across vehicle types. Here, I only focused on electric vehicles. The numbers show everything, but the text above is only for electric. So within electric vehicles, which mode has the least emissions? So buses have the least, and they're 24% lower than the next best, which is electric two-wheelers. Then three-wheelers and two-wheelers have similar emissions per passenger kilometer. Then passenger cars, and then the shared cars. So shared cars, actually, we think are better for the environment because people are sharing vehicles. But interestingly, they have higher emissions because there's a lot of deadheading that happens. Almost 50% of the time, taxis are idling and then going somewhere to get the next passenger, which means that the emissions per passenger kilometer are higher for shared vehicles. But at a life cycle level, they still save because of the overall kilometers operated. So now that we have the full analysis, so as a city, when I have to take a choice decision, so what should I focus on? There is the mode choice option where should I focus on moving to public transport, or should I focus on moving to electric vehicles, or should I focus on moving to renewable energy? I mean, the answer is you should do everything, but the relative impact of each of these is the question. So right now, in some of the cities we looked at, the car to two-wheeler ratio is around 20% to 80%. Suppose there are 100 people who are going in cars and two-wheelers. Here we have excluded three-wheelers. but looking at cars and two-wheelers, so their emission would be around 2,600 tons. So suppose you introduce one bus, and that bus attracts people from these vehicle types, cars and two-wheelers, in their current usage proportion. That the emissions will be around 2,620 tons if they were in cars and two-wheelers, but it will reduce to 1,300 tons if they were in buses. So there is a net 1,300 ton saving by shifting people to buses for every bus. And then this bus is electric. It will give you another 460 tons of saving. And this electricity is renewable, so it will give you another 680 tons of savings. So, so that's the net impact overall. So the relatively mode shift to buses, even if it is a diesel bus, actually delivers bigger impact than electrification and its clean energy transition. But of course, India is already doing a lot on the last two items, to moving towards electric buses and towards cleaner energy. We need to focus also on the mode shift much more. I mean, there are policies, but at a city level, we see that investments are still road-based. So we need to focus a lot more on that topic. Yeah, thanks. The full report is available on the link, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Ravi and Vatsalya, for presenting the results of this study and going into the recommendations and the numbers behind them in a little bit more detail there. We are now moving on to hear from our distinguished guests. And if you do have questions, please continue to put them in the Q&A. We are running a little low on time, so some of us have been responding to them in the Q&A function itself. And if we have time, we'll get to those live. So now we're switching gears a little bit to hear from Mr. Sudhendu Sinha. He will be telling us about the relevance of some of this work and the wider work under the NDC-TIA and DT projects to the impact of LCA on transport policymaking. As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Sinha is an advisor at Niti Aayog, the public policy think tank of the Government of India, for those of you who might not be familiar. Niti Aayog has been a very strong supporter of sustainability policies on the broad spectrum, but in transport, they've collaborated very closely and worked very closely on projects related to financing, behavior change, electric mobility adoption, and they participate very actively in the dialogue surrounding this. And so we are very delighted to have Mr. Sinha provide his insights. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Sinha. Over to you.
Hi, Malati. This is Joseph from the Sinha's office. Sorry, he's on an important call. Yeah, so he's on a call. In the meantime, we'll if you have any other speaker, you can go ahead with other distinguished speaker. Otherwise, yeah.
Excellent. We will just switch gears here. Is Mr. Vishal Kapoor available? Excellent, Mr. Kapoor. So we will just swap our agendas there and hear from Mr. Kapoor first. Thank you for being on call there. And so just to introduce you a little bit, Mr. Kapoor is the CEO of CESL, as I mentioned earlier in the webinar. And just as background, CESL was mandated by the Government of India to lead the demand aggregation and standardization of electric buses. This is a very large procurement project that I think has made international headlines, so many of us are probably already aware of some of the kind of record-breaking case studies that are coming out of India in this field. This is a feat that achieved the lowest price per kilometer of e-buses, even lower than the cost of diesel and CNG buses. And they're moving on to developing similar aggregation efforts for three-wheelers, as well as working on carbon credits. So lots going on in that space, in the EV space, in India under Mr. Kapoor's watch. So we're delighted to have you here, Mr. Kapoor. The floor is yours. We look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Malati, and thank you, ITF, for having me here. It was such a pleasure actually seeing this report, and the short presentation actually captured so many important insights. It's a no-brainer. Most of the things, we understand that as and when we switch towards the electric side of things, things become much better. But one very striking thing that I actually saw in that report was about the metros, and specifically for the Indian context, what learning that I would take here is that the ridership is extremely important, and metros are very good for means of public transport in terms of if you have anything beyond 40,000 people per hour movement. And a large number of cities across India and the way they are built, unlike foreign countries other than India, especially the Western world, where there is a clear-cut defined area of a central business district. Here, it is not so. So even though we do see a lot of benefits in terms of the metro, the social impact, and even the environmental impact, unless and until we reach those levels of ridership, and I was seeing some, and I'll go through the report in greater detail, I believe that metros might not be that good an option, especially for the 2-tier or 3-tier cities. And that was something that was very striking. And one more thing that was very striking was that the existing policy versus the BEV net zero status, I mean, there's a very little difference there. So one thing that strikingly comes out is that probably the policies that are in place right now and the net zero, I think we are well on that path, at least on the transport front, because what needs to be done right now is implementation. Policies may be right. There may be several improvements that may be required. And yes, that's a continuous process. But I think the policies are there. And the only thing that needs to be done is implement them efficiently and as effectively as possible. One thing that I could see in the report, and when we compare the battery electric vehicles, at least from the looks and feel of it, what I saw, perhaps it will be definitely a good idea to also include in this modal shift analysis the requirement of upgradation of the distribution infrastructure. As I could see, it is about like the vehicles require roads as an infrastructure. I mean, both the battery vehicles and the normal vehicles, the road infrastructure and the allied infrastructure is same for the both. But what the addition comes is the power distribution level of infrastructure, the impact on the peak loads, and various other associated parameters, and the so-called investments and research that is required to ensure that a dynamic demand response works and the vehicle to grid investments are there. And apart from even only the financial investments, I think there are other issues also that may have to be factored in the whole scheme of things to probably get a better hang of the situation, especially on the let's say, for example, setting up of distribution infrastructure, and that does require will have some impact on the carbon inputs into the, and it will definitely change the matrix to some extent. One thing again, 100% RE on electric buses. So if we see the overall scenario, so we have a choice. If I am a state transport undertaking or any kind of an operator who's operating electric buses, so I have a choice to get into, even the get the 100% renewable energy. But from the overall scheme of things, energy is fungible. The electrons don't differentiate between, whether it's coming from RE. So as long as the overall infrastructure is coming up on the renewable side and the grid emission factors are going down, I think that specific element to show that electric vehicles are probably much better. I mean, it's a no-brainer. If anything fired up by renewable energy, it will be much more effective on the LCA methodology. It'll always be much better. But making a specific investment into for RE, then in that case, you will have to factor in the cost for setting up that renewable infrastructure added on to that electric bus, add on the other carbon related costs that are coming up for specifically for renewable. And in that case, probably the matrix will change. So I believe as long as we are moving towards the electric side of things, and as long as the grids are coming up with more and more renewable penetration, and renewable penetration, we also know there is an efficiency in the renewable generation also. Again, there are various offsets. I mean, a larger plant will probably be more efficient in solar or wind generation. But at the same time, a decentralized one at the grid level will reduce the losses. So there are, pluses and minuses. But then if you put renewable specific to the electric buses and bracket them together, the costs will definitely go up. So that probably needs to be done. And in the life cycle costing or life cycle assessment methodology, while we are aware that the government of India, especially on the financial life cycle assessment methodology, I think the government of India has now enabled through their Works Manual 2022 this methodology, but probably not into the carbons and those kind of things so far. But in especially on the public procurement processes, I think it probably will have to understand that, or probably keep this in mind, that it becomes a little bit controversial, because when we talk about carbon and the carbon prices and the kind of volatility that we are looking at in the carbon space, and the longer the period that we are looking at on the life cycle, let's say about 10 years, let's assume that the carbon credits that are coming and we are trying to net that off. There's a high element of risk, and this does put questions at several times on the decision makers as to what is right, what is wrong, whether we should have taken some a different kind of methodology while offsetting the carbon and the carbon related finance. So that's a very important thing. And at the same time, just to complicate it a little bit further, social impact is also very important, because in a life cycle costing methodology, the environmental and the social impacts, they have to be added on together. It's not only about the environment, it's also about the social impact. And the more we expand from the, let's say, the environment side of things into the social impact assessment, and the trying to figure out the socio-economic cost benefits, the more complicated and more controversial the study becomes, because somehow the way it has happened, and that's why these kind of webinars are happening, humanity, as we have developed our fundamentals towards markets, somehow finances have always seen a higher primacy than other things, and as a result of which we are deliberating today as we stand on all these things. And somehow we have not been able to concretize our methodologies towards assessing the socio-economic cost benefits, the environment cost benefits. And on the academic front, yes, a lot has been done. Again, it is a lot controversial, and academicians and researchers, they'll have lots of debates. But that debate in the public policy domain, I believe, becomes a little bit controversial and makes it difficult for people to make concrete decisions, especially when you may see that overall life cycle costing may be tremendously beneficial, even though controversial towards one side of things. It may just happen that the financial side is showing just the different story. So I believe we need to concretize things. This study is really fantastic. At least I learned a lot from it. And I can promise here, I mean, when over this weekend, I'm going to study this report from end to end, because there were so many wonderful insights that came out from this, especially on the kWh per passenger kilometer assessments. And I think it will definitely be a great read. It's definitely a fantastic starting point, baseline. It has been able to establish, and definitely a report that policymakers and implementers will be able to use in their regular practice. Thank you very much for inviting me and allowing me to share my thoughts on the report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kapoor, and thanks so much for your kind words and your comments on this study. It's been very valuable to listen to your thoughts on it and expanding it, of course, beyond this is one piece of the puzzle. We need to look at the social impacts. We need to look a lot more beyond just the environmental considerations. Thank you very much. It's been wonderful having you. And to close off our event, we are running a little over time, so I think we will keep the questions to be answered in the little Q&A box itself. We're working hard on those. But to close our event, I would like to now ask Mr. Sinha to deliver his remarks. I already, of course, introduced Mr. Sinha, and so I can just directly pass over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Malati. So, like, I was just, as you were taking us through this presentation, I was just, and of course, the remarks that were being made by Vishal and the comments of Ravi, yes. And of course, Gerald spoke about that in detail. I was just wondering how this particular tool can be used in A, sensitizing the planners and policymakers at the state level, and maybe B, how can we use it in creating a kind of long-term mobility planning for the cities? So suppose if we plan for a city for a substantially long period of time, how this particular tool, the set of information that is available, that could help in convincing them, and maybe also help in thinking that what could be an ideal mix of different vehicle segments, different fuel types, because naturally you can't think of a situation where 100% EVs would be there. Maybe that would take quite some time. But even before that, how could that ideal mix could be developed so that environmentally it has got the least impact, for mobility it has got the best solution? So probably I was just thinking on those lines, and I was discussing internally simultaneously that how this tool can be used. So maybe that we do have some questions. We ourselves have some questions on which we would like to have clarity. And I'm sure that within a day or so, those of you would like to consolidate those questions and give it back to you so that you are in a position to respond, so that we take it forward in our initiative for state support mission, in which mobility is also a very, very important theme. So like how this particular tool can become a useful instrument with us for taking the mobility of different cities who are, who want to transform themselves. So precisely that is what I would like to say, and I must be congratulating your entire team who has worked on it. And I do see that it is going to have a lot of impact and use for us in future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sinha. Indeed, the ideal goal is for this tool and this study to be used by policymakers, and we'd be delighted to speak further about how you can support, state actors in setting those policy targets. So thank you, everyone. This brings us to the end of our webinar. And for those of you who may not have had all your questions answered, when we share all the details, the recording after the webinar, I do encourage you to reach out and respond to us, and we'll hopefully be able to answer your questions offline. I would just like to end by thanking, first of all, our speakers who are here today. Gerald and Ravi, it's been wonderful working with you. Mr. Kapoor and Mr. Sinha. Of course, Vatsalya and I have been delighted to have you both at this webinar. But I would be remiss to not mention some of the colleagues who are not here today. Number one, Pier Paolo Cazzola was the original kind of creator of the first version of this tool that has now been developed into the one that's characterized for India. So thank you to him. Dr. Lisa Malik and Subhrajit Sengupta, who have been working very closely with us to exactly take it from this first version of the tool to the one that was used for the study. So thank you to both of you. Apostolos, who's behind the scenes working the Zoom webinar magic, and Ronan and Carl, our colleagues over in our communications team, who have been very much supporting this effort. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to our audience for your engagement, and we invite you to check out the tool, check out the study, and get back to us with your questions and comments. Have a very good day, and thanks again for joining.
Thank you very much.